Hello, welcome. We are almost through the semester as we are covering, I would say the penultimate, but perhaps the third to last topic, and that is World War II. All right. So let me get your names down and I will shortly see here. Sorry. Give you your credit. All right. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for your faithful participation. All right, it's often the same people. Let's see here. All right, let's see. All right. All right, let's see. So I'm gonna go ahead and share the page and jump right into it, okay? So also I will have this, as soon as I'm done with this video, I will post this online. I don't even have it posted yet because the last assignment that we've already gone over is due tomorrow night. All right, so but that's typical. We want to stay ahead of schedule. All right, so like I said, this will be up very shortly. So what I do is I give an introduction to just war doctrine. Like you try to find a frame of reference for what type of discourse you want to have on a given topic, right? And so with World War II, I went ahead and went with an old theme, and that goes back to the Catholic Church in the 300s AD. All right, and its notions of just war doctrine, of fighting for the right reasons and fighting in the right manner. All right, so in both those broad categories, why you fight and how you fight are to meet certain Christian standards. And you could make the argument rather easily when you see certain bridges, intellectual bridges like Hugo Grotius and the Dutch humanists in the early modern era, like in the 1600s. They incorporated this just war doctrine from the Catholic Church, and they kind of made it more into a secular framework, but it's still the same thing. So at any rate, as you're looking at it here, you have, gosh, where to begin with, right? Let's see here. Look at here. Romans and Thessalonians in the Bible contend that governments with police and military forces are ordained of God, even if they are unbelievers and they're not aware that they are being used by God, says this scripture, to administer God's dictates of divine justice and righteous indignation, his righteous anger against sin and against evil. So you have a difference between thou shalt not kill as the sixth commandment under the Mosaic law, and you have wiggle room here in Romans and Thessalonians, whereby it states that in the capacity of serving as the state can bring about violent justice in society. All right. So at any rate, let's see here. So moving on, let's see here. So conversely, a just war may be fought in a chivalric manner, like the noblesse oblige, the nobleman's obligation, right? To protect a weaker party, unable to defend itself from the unwarranted aggression of a stronger party. So hence the proverbial bully, right? Let's see here. Moreover, a just war may be fought to defend one's own people from unwarranted aggression, or to prevent or rectify a clear injustice involving unwarranted despoliation, taking possessions from people by force, okay? Taking land from people by force, all right? Inequity, unfairly depriving a party of his or her, quote, due, or just generically harm, okay? So as for the manner in which a just war is to be fought, Hugo Grotius demanded all, but not limited to, the following. It ought to be officially declared. It ought to be without deceptive or preemptive attacks. The good guy usually doesn't hit first. It ought to be gentlemanly fought between official professional armed forces with non-combatants and civilians left outside the venue of battle, okay, to be considered out of bounds, okay? As we might say in today's parlance, as football players are to hit one another with pads on the field and to leave the people up in the stands alone, okay? So let's see here. Negotiations for a cessation of fighting ought to be continually sought. So while you're fighting, you ought to always be looking for a diplomatic way out of it. As a gentleman longs to end the barbarity of war as soon as possible, provided that injustice be averted. Furthermore, any further legal or societal norms of proper behavior befitting a soldier in one's contemporary world ought to be recognized and followed. That attacks responsive to those of another ought to be proportional, okay? So someone, like Pancho Villa attacked Columbus, New Mexico, and they killed about 17 Americans. You don't drop a hydrogen bomb on Mexico in response to that. That would certainly not be considered proportional, all right? And then, of course, some people think that this is all nice on a piece of paper, but that it's not realistic. That war, that all is fair in love and war, and that, these boundaries are hard to maintain when you're actually in battle, in the war itself, all right? So at any rate, within such boundaries, the Catholic Church and Hugo Grotius contend a Christian may fight, kill, and die in battle without fear of hypocrisy and condemnation from man and God, all right? So just war doctrine. So then what we do is, number one, is read only, and it's court history, all right? It's going to say that the reason for which we fought was worthwhile, that fascism in Germany and Italy, and somewhat something akin to fascism in Japan, was so inherently dangerous to all that we hold dearly in modern Western civilization that in and of itself, it was worth it to go and fight against the spread of this dangerous ideology. So firstly, with the ideology, it's adherence to almost blindly following an autocratic ruler, right? They believe like in kind of like Rousseau's general will, right? And how people ought to be forced into the general will, whatever is best for the country, that they're not to abide by any dissent. You can't disagree. You can't go against the grain. Dissent is squashed, right? But then again, that's already scary enough in Rousseau's book when he considers the general will that which the majority want to happen. Because you could certainly have tyranny of the majority. We went over that with Andrew Jackson in his time period, right? But this, right, is you have a leader who supposedly you trust, who almost mystically, there's almost a religious component to it, to their adoration of the Führer, of the leader of Nazi Germany especially, that you have this nearly infallible ruler who alone knows what the general will is, who could almost mystically discern what it is and knows how to lead the country in its direction. So there's no dissent from this leader. You can't disagree with him, you can't oppose him, etc. Which runs into the second part of how scary fascism can be, is not only do you have this blind credence in the will of an autocratic ruler over your entire country, but the Nazis were very, very well read with Friedrich Nietzsche. And you have this desire for an Übermensch, an overman, a superman, if you will, right? And what Nietzsche said was that he thought Christianity was an impediment to the success of Europe. He thought that its notions of mercy and compassion rendered those who should have been allowed by nature to die out as the weak and the sickly. That Christianity wants to artificially preserve those types of people, that demographic, and that Christianity also its notion of turning the other cheek, etc. And so he wanted someone who was willing to absolutely go against what he called a slave morality of Christianity, what the slaves adhered to, and go to the master morality. The master does as he wills, might makes right, etc. And so this Ubermensch is supposed to have the audacity to absolutely just dispel and crush all Judeo-Christian values, and is much more Darwinian, squashes the weak, always is militaristically imperialistic, and takes land for the fatherland, Germany, etc. And so that's another component that is scary about fascism, is that they are for the institutionalized use of force, inwardly, domestically, against all other oppositional political parties, all religious groups, all other factions that disagree with the leading fascist leaders. There's to be no toleration of dissent. And then even to the point of physical violence. You had the black shirts that went and roughed people up and used physical violence against the communists and the socialists in Germany at the rallies, etc. And then of course you had the intimidating force of the Gestapo, and the Gestapo with the military police, who for any type of reason in which you are not adhering to what the Fuhrer wants to do, they could put you supposedly in a work camp. Or prison, and oftentimes that could end up being a concentration camp that you didn't survive. So at any rate, and then outwardly, with foreign policy, is they were absolutely for, a living space, Lebensraum, right? They needed living space for their German people. And of course, that living space was land currently under the sovereignty of other countries and rulers and governments that were institutionally seen as legitimate in the eyes of the world. And so there's no worrying about that and about their rights. So fascism, right, it could be very, very dangerous. And then of course with the Nazis, as they took it into the final solution, right? And the final solution was a euphemism used in one of their SS meetings. And of course, we know now that the final solution was death. And it was to anybody who did not fit within their Volksgemeinschaft, their people's community, right? And so if you were homosexual, if you were ardently, zealously Christian or Jehovah's Witness, etc., and refused to, give that adulation to the Fuhrer, you did not fit into this group. If you were a leftist in your politics, you did not fit into the people's community. And then, of course, they tried to get you to, they tried to use census reports and these physiological checkups to check if you had the physiological features and you had at least nothing within 1/8 of your bloodline down through your grandparents on both sides of Jewishness, Albanian Gypsy blood, Slavic blood, none of those types of things. You would be disqualified from the Volksgemeinschaft. And so the euphemism, of course, was labor camps. And then, of course, when we liberated these camps, we saw that they were death traps, Dachau, Auschwitz, and all these others, right, where they engaged in mass murder. So at any rate, they not only did that, right, but as they spread from country to country, they imposed this fascist hegemony or domination and the Holocaust on places that they took over. So Anne Frank, her famous book, she was in the Netherlands. She was in Holland. right? That Holland was taken over by the Nazis. And so they began taking over one country after another in Europe. And then, of course, Imperial Japan. So you see some similarities with Imperial Japan, or somewhat fascist Japan. So let's see here. What do I have here? In the spring of 1936, several Japanese congressmen and even a prime minister who had questioned the military establishment's domestic and foreign aggression were violently and publicly assassinated until all were too frightened to take on their military leader, Hideki Tojo, and his entourage. All right. And so what they did is they had the emperor of Japan, Hirohito. He, instead of, as they had it before, the diet or the Congress or the parliament in Japan was to be elected. And they had multi-parties, and the winning party of the most votes in the parliamentary election chose amongst themselves that ruling party, their prime minister. But now that went away by this time, by the mid to late 30s. People were getting assassinated, people were getting intimidated, and so forth. So it pretty much came down to one party, the military party establishment in Japan, and no opposition was tolerated in the press, etc. And then the emperor chose the prime minister, and even the emperor was supposedly much intimidated and pressured by the militarist party who to choose when he chose Hideki Tojo. So at any rate, and then Japan, of course, early on took over Korea. And then after that, they went into Southeast Asia. And then after that, they went into Manchuria. And then from Manchuria, they went into China, right? And so it seemed as if they were having the same insatiable, movements of aggrandizing their territory as were the Nazi Germans. And remember with Germany, right? They said, okay, the Treaty of Versailles was unfair to us, so we're not going to pay war reparations anymore. And the Allies said, okay, fine, we'll deal with this in some other way. They didn't necessarily say okay, but they couldn't force them. So they stopped paying the war reparations. Then they said, all right, we are going to remilitarize the Rhineland between us and France. And the French did not want that. And so they played a game of chicken, and they brought this new, burgeoning Nazi army and brought it into the Rhineland to face this international force of police, and the international force backed down and removed itself from the Rhineland. So they won in this kind of game of chicken, if you will. And then from there, they said, well, we believe that the people of Austria, who are Germanic in culture and language, want to be adopted by us. And because they were supposed to not be able to do that in the Treaty of Versailles terms. And so they contended that they had a referendum in Austria, and they contended that it was the Austrians overwhelmingly voted to have the Anschluss, the addition or annexation to Germany. So that happened, and this was further scaring people, but everyone was too afraid to stand up to Hitler. And then he says, okay, now with this new Sudetenland, in this new country that you formed as Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland has a lot of Germanic people there with Germanic culture, and we're taking that back. So then they went and they took the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia. Well, it didn't take long at all, and they took over the rest of Czechoslovakia as a brand new country. So then when they did that, they were already saying that they wanted the port of Danzig from Poland. And finally, the Allies said, not one more inch. You bullied enough, that's enough. And what does Hitler do? He doesn't just go for Danzig, he goes for all of Poland on September 1st, 1939, and just invades Poland. And then from there, his army was ready to hit the Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Norway, Finland, and well, not so much Finland. As a matter of fact, with the Finnish, he allowed, he did a pact, a non-aggression pact with Stalin of the Soviet Union, and the Russians actually invaded Finland. But the other ones, so you have Norway, Finland, and Sweden. So Sweden and Norway were attacked, as well as Denmark, by the Nazi army. And then, of course, from Poland, they're going to go through the Ardennes forest, which no one thought that the Panzer tanks could make it through. They went through the Ardennes forest and into France and invaded France. So really, you could definitely make the argument that these fascist countries started this war, their aggression, their imperialism, right? And that supposedly what they stood for, if they were to make the rest of the world in their own image, would have been a very scary world. And you see there this picture, this horrible picture toward the bottom. That is the Einsatzgruppen. And the Einsatzgruppen were known as the cleanup crew. They would go into countries that they considered outside the realm of the people's community. And so hence the civilians had the final solution attributed to them, that they were to be killed. And so they would go behind the fighting lines, and they would round up civilians and engage in mass murder. Okay. And so it was just horrible, horrible stuff. And then, of course, the guy on the bottom right, you might be familiar with, that's Joseph Mengele. That is that awful, awful Nazi doctor at Auschwitz who engaged in cruel experimentation with little Jewish children, supposedly in the name of science. So at any rate, then with number two, if I contend that we were fighting for the right reasons on number one, I'm saying I'm doing good old deflection, and I'm saying that the bad guys fought in a horrific manner, right? So so now that's the second avenue, the second area of just war doctrine, is how a war is fought. So not only did they represent a great peril to the world, according to number one, but according to number two, the manner by which they fought was awful. So I focus on the Japanese and on one book called Unjust Enrichment, and it is something else. I mean, it starts off with giving the fact that 40% of prisoners of war under the Japanese died during the war, didn't even make it to prisoner exchange by the end of the war. That is incredible, 40%. And so you see how you get behind the mindset of the Japanese. Remember, with this political party, this military party, they were for a return to the code of Bushido, the samurai code of death before dishonor, and they thought that anybody willing to surrender and not fight to the death was not worthy of keeping his life, was not worthy of being treated like a human being. He was less than a human being for his cowardice in surrendering. So that had a lot to do with it. And so, but look what they put here in this Latin term. They said, as circumstances dictate, supposedly is what that Latin term means. So when they tried to get the beginnings of what will become the UN at the end of this war, the Red Cross and these other organizations trying to get them to exchange prisoners of war, they said, well, we're gonna see as circumstances dictate. And so you had the Bataan Death March, right, where they kept them on almost a jog pace through the island of Corregidor in the Philippines. And some had been shot, some of the Allied prisoners of war. Some were wounded. And those who couldn't make it, they bayoneted. If you fell by the wayside, they just put a bayonet in you and move on. And so it was harsh. And so let's see here. In the spring of 42, when 5,000 of not quite 20,000 American prisoners of war perished amidst a 65-mile march across the peninsula. All right. And then the Morros Morro incident is when Americans were shot in their ship, and they tried to avoid drowning by getting into a Japanese ship and seeking surrender. And the Japanese hacked them to pieces, the young men that were making it up on their ship. And so they were not shown any mercy. All right. So at any rate, you have things such as this. The leaders, and then in some cases it was supposed to be an honorable thing. Our leaders, our Marines at Wake Island. At Wake Island, our Marines fought off like 3 different frontal attacks of the Japanese with 4 times the number of men as there were American Marines, and supposedly they were impressed by the American Marines' valor, but what they got in return for that was they were beheaded as supposedly an honorable way to die. So just crazy stuff. And then I didn't even mention the rape of Nanjing, or sometimes called Nanking, in China. If you wanted to Google that, just beware. It's gruesome. It's gruesome. The number of civilians in China that were killed by the Japanese soldiers. And then also I think of, like with the Philippines, is that the euphemism of comfort women is, it wasn't bad enough that they forced women in civilizations that they took over as to be as prostitutes for their soldiers, but they took them prepubescent. They took girls and did things with girls as well. So at any rate, then I start to turn the page a little bit, turn the tide. And now numbers 3 and 4 are revisionist, right? Where they're not praising the US and showing how awful the enemy was and so forth, but being much more critical toward us. So number 3, I contend that the manner by which we fought was not always up to par by these standards of just war doctrine. So for instance, the first one I think of 2 that are very salient, that stand out, is one is, as you may recall, under the Operation Magic and under the Enigma machine, we decoded what the Japanese and the Germans were sending out as messages. We could get access. It wasn't that difficult to use the technology available to find out the messages that each was putting out. But then the messages themselves were coded, so they'd be like, a blue umbrella, cloudy day, etc. Things that in and of themselves it was incoherent, and we somehow cracked their code as far as what each euphemism meant, etc., etc. And it greatly helped us win the war. All right. So as you probably know, the turning point of the war against Japan was at Midway. And at Midway, we set them up. We knew their code for Midway. And we contended that we were having a water problem there on the island. And it worked. They agreed. They sent a flotilla, a carrier. They sent like 3 carriers with Japanese Zeros heading toward the island, and we were ready for them. And we still had to get lucky to win that battle, by the way. But it was huge, right? Because we took out 3 of their carriers on one day, and they had fewer than 10 carriers for the entire war, and 3 just in one day. But at any rate, the code really was a great, inestimable help and value. But the problem is, as we started dispatching, we started getting codes from them saying that they were suspicious of us being on to them, of us having cracked their code, right? Now, if they redo it, who knows if we ever, starting from scratch, if we ever get a chance to crack their codes again, right? That was just that was a nightmare to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and so forth, right? So what do we have to do? What do they feel compelled to do? Is to go have a time in which they did not read and they did not disseminate the meaning of the codes. So hence, there were guys that were still reading the codes and still interpreting them, and they knew exactly what the Japanese were going to do, and they deliberately did not notify our officers and our military men, so that it would look as if we got caught by surprise. We had no idea they were coming there, and hence we don't have their code. So then it will let them, it will convince them that they could keep the same code, right? But imagine your family members being on some of those ships and some of those islands that could have been warned, but weren't, to keep it a secret that we had cracked the code. All right. And then another one that I think is very salient that stands out is carpet bombing. Now, I will qualify this. From what I've read, the British were ahead of us, and the British had to almost coerce us into it. Okay. You could find some very, very vindictive and callous decisions and quotes from Winston Churchill of Great Britain. And you got to remember that during the Blitz, Nazi Germany was just indiscriminately bombing London and Liverpool and these major British cities and killing tens of thousands of British civilians. Okay, so the Germans did do it first. And so Prime Minister Winston Churchill had no qualms with doing it back, right? To him, is, hey, we could do it, and it will dampen their morale, right? It'll also mess up their infrastructure and so forth. And with us, right, we had what we developed in response to working with the British is we developed a system of points, right? So for instance, if there were war munitions, that was worth the most points, right? If they were actually manufacturing guns, tanks, jet fuel, etc., stuff that was directly linked to their military effort, then that was worth, let's say, 4 or 5 points in a given city. Okay. And then if they had beneath that, if they had telecommunications, radio, radar, things, getting their provisions and logistically their stuff from one city to another, and we could disrupt that, and that could hence disrupt their war effort and make things a lot less efficient, then that was worth like 3 points. And we were okay with that, right? But the idea is, right, is that, so we did first start doing that. So for instance, a big city that we hit had a lot of war munition factories, and that was Dresden, Germany, Dresden. And so we supposedly aimed for the war munition factories and the places that were directly linked to the war effort, right? But then in Dresden, actually, we did it at night. We did it in the midst of lots of wind and rain and sleet and hail. And so we dropped these flares so that we could see the city better. And the flares supposedly, accidentally, inadvertently turned into incendiaries and lit the city of Dresden on fire. And so we burnt Dresden down. And Dresden was a beautiful Gothic, old, historic city in Germany. And tens of thousands of civilians who had nothing to do with the war effort living in Germany died on account of this. And so by the end of the war, we started hitting areas that did not have many points, right, to justify hitting them. And so, for instance, the main one, of course, is Hiroshima. Hiroshima, when we dropped the bombs there, they did not have war munition factories. They did not have telecommunication facilities. They really didn't merit a spot according to our criteria of a city to be hit. But sadly, there's evidence that we did it just for that reason, because the city was still pristine and still almost untouched. And we wanted the world and the Japanese to see just how deadly this new bomb was and how much damage it can do. So yikes, right? So at any rate, we dropped that on Hiroshima, and Hiroshima didn't give us the rationale that we wanted, that we would like to have, as far as building, fighter jets or tanks or anything like that. So at any rate, you have those types of things that happen. Then you also had Schweinfurt. At Schweinfurt, Germany, we were apprised, we were learning that our P-51 Mustang up at a certain altitude did very well against the Messerschmitt and other jets of the Luftwaffe, of the German Air Force. But we had to get them up at a certain altitude to be able to take advantage of those odds. So what we did is we sent bombers, and as you know, the P 29s, that all these other bombers were very slow and cumbersome. They were just well known for being able to hold and let off a lot of munition. So at any rate, we used the bombers as decoys, and we contended that they had a bombing raid to go on, and it got the Luftwaffe up in the air. They started taking out our bombers, and then our P-51s took them out. So it was wonderful in the end. But what if your family member, or what if you were in one of those bombers that was used as a sacrificial lamb for this fight? So sometimes they made decisions like that, right? That's a picture of Dresden right there. And then lastly, I say, did we really fight for the right reasons, right? Because when you look at the Atlantic Charter made by our President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, they said they were fighting for a new world that would protect individual rights and the dignity of the individual human being all throughout the world. Okay, well, if we did, why did we treat our people of color the way that we did? So you see here, according to this book, Mexican Americans saw themselves excluded from enjoyment of the same rights and aspirations that many of their neighbors took for granted. They were in separate schools still, segregated schools, okay? Also, there was housing segregation, whereby a lot of people, they were making these agreements that they would not lease, loan, sell their property to Latinos. That actually was a real thing, a real contract that some people had people sign. And then, of course, you also had the latitude of creditors at this time, because you don't have FHA loans and all that yet, backed up by the government, that just wouldn't give house loans to Mexican Americans. All right. So so they were also poorly represented politically. Remember gerrymandering? We went over that in the last one. So remember, you have like let's say you have this part of a map, and this is 100% of the Mexican Americans in that given state. You take this little part right here, about 20% of them, and you incorporated it into an Anglo district. Then you take 20% of them right here, put it into this Anglo district, and so forth. You split them up and force them to become the minority in their voting district. That was known as gerrymandering, and that absolutely happened. There were poll taxes that were deliberately expensive, and they knew the poor Mexican people couldn't afford. There were literacy tests that they made more difficult for Hispanic people than they did for regular Anglo-American civilians. Okay. So at any rate, and then right here, moreover, in a Ford Foundation study at 60, statistics suggested that per capita Latino income was not even half as much as that of white Americans. Okay. So then, moving on here. Aware of these inequities, 500,000 Latinos, nevertheless, served courageously in World War II, returning home knowing that they were equal to their American counterparts. So you had some who earned high medals. Guy Gabaldon, Macario Garcia, Angel Romero. At any rate, you have actually Angel Romero did not. But you see here, right? They endured everything that other Americans endured. So you have, for instance, the D-Day invasion. Oh my goodness. I don't know if you guys have seen like Saving Private Ryan, but that scene of the D-Day invasion, that was not really exaggerated. How dangerous and how likely you were to be shot and killed in that invasion. So Angel Romero was a survivor of that. And then you have Cabo Rodriguez. He endured the death march, the Bataan Death March in the Philippines under the Japanese. And it says, at the risk to his life, he and his comrades tried to assist the prisoners who had ceased marching, in addition to failing to finally rest for fear that the Japanese concession that they could stop and rest was a trap, and to desperately eating turnips from among the rocks amidst being starving. Okay. So sadly, while such heroics and hardship and deprivation endured by Mexican Americans may have been appreciated by their military peers, they did not elicit their nation's federal government's grateful cessation of racial discrimination. And then, of course, you had the Zoot Suit riots. And with the Zoot Suit riots, you had guys that were in the Navy, and they were stationed right there at the oh, it's driving me crazy. I forget the name of the beach. But at any rate, it's a well-known beach in LA. They were stationed there. And they would travel through Los Angeles to the eastern part, to the Mexican-American part, because that's where all the nightlife was. And as they were going into through that area, there was a Mexican-American, a couple of them, and supposedly they began whistling and catcalling the Navy guy's girlfriend. And the Navy guy, standing up for her, got in a fist fight with one of the, as they were called at that time, Pachucos, one of the young Mexican-American men. And the Pachuco broke his jaw. And he went back to the ship, and guys found out about it, and they came back in hordes. And they were looking for any young Mexican-American, especially wearing the Zoot suit that was in style for Mexican-American Pachucos to wear at that time. It was just like their own subculture. And it got bad. It got where the U.S. Armed Forces and the military government, they had to make big threats to people that were leaving and looking for fights against Pachucos. They had guys missing from Las Vegas, and as far away as Las Vegas, who came all the way to LA just to fight Mexican Americans in the midst of this. They were known as the Zoot Suit riots. And then at the same time, there was a guy named Jose Diaz, a young Mexican American who was murdered at a party. And there was a guy named Hank Levas and his buddies. And they all had that same Pachuco look about them in age and demographic. And they were arrested for killing him. And the press just ran with it. The public ran with it. Everyone just assuming that they were guilty. And that this is emblematic of the problem with these young Mexican-American men, that they're thugs, etc. And so at any rate, they went to prison. And then they eventually were let out because one of the girls at the party came forward with evidence of her brother having killed Jose Diaz. And her brother was not in that group with Hank Levas that went to prison. And the only reason why she finally came forward with it is because someone in the meantime had murdered her brother. So what could they do to her brother now? So she came forth with incriminating evidence. And there was no official apology to these young men. I don't remember how many years they served, but I think they at least served a year or two. And they were innocent. So then another one was the Rapido River. This made it to the military courts. Is the Mexican-American boys. A lot of them were from the Santa Fe. No, not Santa Fe. I take that back. El Paso area of Texas. Okay, drafted together. And so a lot of them were, most of them, if not nearly all of them in the regiment, were Mexican Americans. And at the Rapido River in Italy, supposedly they were sent on a semi-suicidal mission to cross this river against a machine gun nest that was just firing across the river at them and would fire the whole way as they're trying to traverse the river. And so several of them did as they were told, and sure enough, were massacred and their bodies falling into the river, until finally one of them took a stand and said, "I don't care. You can court-martial me. We're not going. We're not going across that river." At any rate, it went into the military courts and so forth, and they told them that they felt that they were seen as expendable because they were just Mexican kids, and actually they were not reprimanded for disobeying their leader, but their leader was not reprimanded either. So that was known as the Rapido River incident. And then Felix Longoria, he died for his country, Mexican-American Texan. He dies for his country, and when his body comes back, they began to make plans to have him put in the town's military section of the cemetery. And there was a huge white backlash, and they said no, and they refused to have him buried there because he was Mexican-American. And he'd just given his life for the country. And so at any rate, that got a lot of attention. That got national attention. And a young Lyndon B. Johnson had Felix Longoria sent to Washington, D.C. To be buried with honors. All right. And then, of course, I just add, even though this is a Mexican-American class, I add the fact of what we did to the Japanese. Executive Order 9066 ordered not only Japanese immigrants, but Japanese Americans to be put into internment camps here on the West Coast. There are about 24 of them. All right. Very Spartan conditions. Guards with guns. If you were to try to run, try to escape, they could shoot you. That the place called Tool Lake. Tool Lake is where they brought their troublemakers, the ones that said they would never fight for the U.S. and that they would not forswear their allegiance to Japan. A lot of them, they believe, did that out of anger for the way they were being treated. They put them in Tool Lake and I'm sorry, Tulare, at Tulare. And there in Tulare, they had a couple riots. And on the second riot, they shot into the crowd and they killed a few of them. So technically, a life, I think about 3, a life had been lost in these internment camps. All right. So then, and then, by the way, there was a Fred Korematsu, Fresno, California. His case made it to the Supreme Court. And he said, according to the 14th Amendment, anyone born here is a citizen. And he says, you can't do this to your citizens, to your Japanese Americans who are born in the U.S. as citizens. And they said, no, they can. If this were civilian time, you would be right. But since we're in wartime, they could have special wartime powers. And so hence, because we're in the midst of a war, the Japanese Americans had no constitutional protection of their rights in these camps. Right? So at any rate, so at the end, I just say here, there's a sense of disillusionment among some people. And then we were a lesser evil at best. So this is a lot more cynical than I started off with. This is a picture of Hank Levas and his group of, quote, Pachucos. And I also could have done more this time on African Americans. A lot of African American women came into the East Bay at the beginnings of like Oakland and Richmond, being highly African American in demographics. They came and got well-paid jobs working in the Kaiser shipyards and as riveters and welders, etc. And so in reality, Rosie the Riveter was this, Anglo woman on the cartoon pictures flexing her muscles, right? But a lot of Rosie the Riveters were Black and Hispanic as well. So at any rate, They faced, though, a lot of racism in the East Bay when they came. Restaurants that wouldn't serve them, apartment complexes that wouldn't rent to them, etc. So, not to get too much ahead, but when we get to the civil rights movement, right? Structural history, when you look at forces bigger than any individual, almost anybody will include World War II as like what's the word I'm thinking of? A catalyst toward the civil rights movement, where certain demographics are going to do well for themselves. They're going to serve the country well and be proud of it. But then the failures, the racial discrimination is going to become all the more, poisonous to them, hypocritical to them, etc. So at any rate, does anybody have any questions? You guys feel okay on this one? World War II is a big one. All right, I have another name I see. All right, I have everyone else's name. All right, you guys hang in there, okay? You guys hang in there and take care. We're almost done. All right.
Have a great Thanksgiving.
You too, Dulce. You guys as well. Thank you. You as well. Have a great holiday.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.